he said, no, this is not what we do here. We're here to worship, and we can't confuse our purpose. What was going on in your head when you heard him say that? How did that make you feel?
That was one of the most overwhelming and completely unbelievable responses we received while we were on the streets, and particularly from a pastor. Now, I want to be careful here. I know that he was preparing to lead the service that day, and he probably had a sermon on his mind, and I'm sure there were many things going on in the church that we didn't really have any understanding of and any information about. So I want to, just kind of be careful and qualify those statements. But at the same time, his response, that's not what we do here. Sam and I had slept outside the night before. We hadn't eaten the day before. We hadn't eaten that morning. We were hungry. We were homeless. We were outcast. We were socially unacceptable in that context. And to have the pastor say to us, that's not what we do here. We are here to worship. Now, in some regards, I get what he's on about. Yes, we come together as Christians on Sunday morning or whenever we hold our church services to worship. We gather together to sing. We gather together to listen to the word be spoken to us and to be preached about, etc. Yes, I get that. At the same time, though, we need to remember Jesus' statement of the great commandment, which is, of course, to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your soul, all of your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus united these two things. He wove these two things together, and I believe, I've done a fair bit of research on this, that this is Christ's command to us, that we unite these things together, that we can't love God. And this is a bold statement, but I think this is what Jesus is on about. We can't love God if we're not loving our neighbor, and we can't love our neighbor if we're not loving God. And so those two things are meant to be put together. And so for this pastor to make this really astonishing statement that that's not what we do here, we don't care for one another here, all we are doing is worshiping here, I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what worship is. At least if we're to take Jesus at his word. When he put those two things together, I think we ought not separate them. So it was just a really overwhelming and very disheartening and discouraging. I mean, it's discouraging from an intellectual, theological level because I think there's an inherent misunderstanding there. It was really unfortunate for Sam and I that morning because we're just kind of thinking, man, we're hungry. Like, we're here in church. We thought that people would care for us, and that's not going to happen.
Wow. Now, you had talked about going to, I guess when you first started off, I guess this is another preparation portion of it all. You wanted to start at a Denver rescue mission to kind of help prepare you. And you hear stories about missions and rescue missions. But, tell us a little bit about what it was like actually staying in a rescue mission in terms of the food, the privacy, the chores. I mean, what was life like while staying in a mission?
Yes, Sam and I spent the first month of our journey actually living in the Denver Rescue Mission. Sam was at one facility just north of Denver, and I was actually in the downtown Denver Rescue Mission. And we decided to do this after the advice of one of our board members. We had put together a board of advisors, and one of the board members was actually the president of the Denver Rescue Mission. And he had advised us, saying, why don't you come and live in the Denver Rescue Mission for a month just to get a bit of an understanding of what it actually takes for people to transition off of the streets. And I think this was an absolutely essential element of our whole journey. I mean, just having the chance to be in the Denver Rescue Mission and to find out more about what the process of rehabilitation actually requires was hugely educational for us. It framed the whole context for the rest of the journey that we were going to have on the streets. And yes, Sam and I submitted ourselves to the rehabilitation program, and that required us to do the regular chores that the other men who were in the rehabilitation program were required to do as well. I was on kitchen crew for a while, actually on the breakfast crew, which meant that I had to get up at 2:30 in the morning to start cooking the breakfast that we would feed to more than 100 and even 150 individuals who would come in for breakfast that morning. And yes, of course, there was privacy. It was really interesting. We were all living in one big room together, or rather, I should say there was a significant lack of privacy, at least certainly what I was used to. But, despite that fact, despite living basically without any private space except my little bunk bed, my single bunk bed, in a room full of other people who were going through the rehabilitation program, what I found was an incredible thankfulness amongst most of the people, certainly not all the people, there were always some disgruntled people, but most of the people who were in the rehabilitation program were so thankful to be there, because they realize my life is in tatters. My life is in shambles. and I desperately need help piecing the pieces back together again. And I'll tell you, I've been doing a lot of work with an organization called the AGRM. This is the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. People can find out more by going to agrm.org. This is a network of rescue missions all across the United States of America, more than 200 member missions in almost every major metropolitan area. These are Christ-centered facilities that have astonishing success rates at helping people transition out of the streets, by addressing things like drug and alcohol addiction, by addressing things like mental instability, by addressing things like a lack of education or a lack of job skills, job training, et cetera. It's a holistic approach to helping people transition off of the streets. The Denver Rescue Mission is a member of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, and I saw the power of their programs, the power of their systematic approach in helping transform people's lives through the power of the Holy Spirit at the Denver Rescue Mission. So it was, despite the difficulties and the complexities and the strangeness of suddenly entering into the rehabilitation program as a 20-year-old guy, I've found this deep joy and thankfulness amongst most of the people who were there, because they realized this is my chance out of my addiction, or this is my chance out of the streets. This is a way that I might actually be able to get my family back, to see my children again, et cetera, et cetera. So a profoundly moving experience.
I thought it was really interesting to read. You gave a number of reasons why people end up homeless. I mean, there are addictions, mental illness, and financial problems, but it's interesting that some people would think that it would be choice. I mean, I can't imagine somebody choosing to live, on a rat and roach-infested street for even one day, much less a lifetime. But do you find that some of the biggest reasons is because of the mental illness? But I know that the number of homeless are growing larger every day, probably because of the financial situation that are as far as the economy. But what are some of the reasons that you find that there's so many homeless?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the hard things, if I do like a broad brush consideration of American homelessness, the problem is that may lead some of us to think that everybody is going to fit neatly into one of those categories. And one of the things that Sam and I found on the streets is that everybody's story is unique. We literally met people in every city we were in, people who hadn't finished high school and people who had PhDs. So all the way across the board, there's a huge variety of people. And so I want to encourage your listeners and people who are listening right now to deal with every single person that you meet as an individual. Sure, we all fit into a statistic and into a category somewhere on somebody's spreadsheet, but I think the profound truth of Christianity is that every single human being is created in the image of God, unique and particular, and we need to respect one another and to care for one another in that way. But you're right in that drug and alcohol addiction had significant impacts for people who were on the street, both leading them to be on the streets as well as people who had found themselves on the streets and then become drug and alcohol addicted. Also mental instabilities, severe forms of schizophrenia, severe bipolar disorders, severe other forms of depression, et cetera, those play in. And then you're right, also just situational hardship. One of the most interesting and harrowing statistics right now, the fastest growing segment of the American homeless population is children under the age of 12. Now, the reason for that is because when you have a single mom of, say, 3 children and she loses her job, they get evicted from their apartment, well, the adult homeless population has gone up by 1, the child homeless population has gone up by 3. So the fastest growing segment of the American homeless population is children under the age of 12. Now, when you put all those things together, you see that this is a very complicated and a very difficult reality, all the more so for us as members of our society who are not on the streets to be a part of the solution, to be willing to stand alongside of our neighbors and love them in Christ's name and encourage them and support them by supporting our local mission, by volunteering there, by praying for the work that's going on at the local mission, et cetera, all very important aspects of what I think it means to love our neighbors as ourselves, particularly in the United States. I want to address one aspect of your question, though, that you mentioned, this idea of choice. Do people choose to be on the streets? Mm-hmm. Now, I want to be careful on this. This is very complicated, but if I can break it down this way, at least by what Sam and I experienced, we met very, very few people. I would say an absolute minority, less than 10%, probably less than 5% of the people that we met would be willing to honestly say, I choose to be on the streets. This is where I want to be. This is how I want to live. And of that very small minority, I want to suggest that a significant portion of them are using the idea of choice as a coping mechanism. And here's what I mean. We met a lot of people on the streets who said, you know what, I tried to get off the streets 4 or 5 times. I've tried to hold down a job. I can't for whatever reason. I've tried to make amends to my family. I can't for whatever reason. And the people who have tried to get off of the streets a significant number of times are probably the people who are going to be saying, I choose it now. And the reason being because it's much easier to exist in a difficult situation if you convince yourself that you've chosen it than it is if you're desiring to get out of that situation but can't. So I think, and this is anecdotal, I don't have any statistical evidence to back this up, this is anecdotal, but I firmly believe that many of the people Sam and I met on the streets who said, I choose this, are simply using choice as a coping mechanism to make the daily difficult reality of trying to survive on the streets a little bit more tolerable for themselves. And that I'm trying to provide a little bit of a window in here to how dehumanizing and depressing and how immensely difficult it is to be a human being made in God's image, created for community, created for love, created for flourishing, trying to exist on the streets. Very, very difficult.
Wow.